Okay, I want to get started this morning. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. It's my pleasure to have as our featured guest today, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, for a conversation about the role NASA can play in overall U.S. foreign policy and national security. This is a webinar that's being broadcast by CSIS. There will be a recording available on our website afterwards if you or others you may know want to reference that in the future. And as we are going through this live webinar, I want to encourage you to ask questions. Administrator Bridenstine is going to start with a keynote address about 15-20 minutes, and then I will moderate a question and answer session with him. If you want to ask a question, you can do it in the Zoom app. If you look down at the bottom of the page, there is a Q&A button within the Zoom app. If you click on that, there's a place where you can type in your question. That will go to our team. We will be culling through those questions as they come in. And then I'm going to ask the ones that seem to be the most popular and most relevant to the topic we're discussing today. So we want to encourage your participation as we go through this event. Before we get started, I want to give a brief introduction of Administrator Bridenstine. He is the 13th NASA Administrator, lucky 13. And so he has been in that position for about 2 years now. Before that, he served as a member of Congress from Oklahoma. And prior to that, he had served in the military in the Navy, flying the E-2C Hawkeye, among other assignments. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Administrator Bridenstine. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Todd. It's great to be here, and I appreciate you hosting this. When we think about the great work that CSIS does, I think having a forum like this where we can discuss national strategy and national security in this forum at CSIS, it's fantastic. So I'll just start by saying it wasn't too long ago. I'm in my living room, right? So I don't normally I normally have like a crew of folks. So if it doesn't look perfect, I apologize. But I think we've got a pretty good background going here. We'll see if that holds up for the rest of the conference. But a couple of things. It wasn't too long ago I got called to the Hill. Members of the House, members of the Senate were asking me how the United States of America fell so far behind China in space exploration. And I thought it was an interesting question. Like, what is it that makes people think that? Well, China had landed on the far side of the moon for the first time in human history with a small robot. And the amount of noise that was created in the system because of the landing on the far side of the moon was pretty big. And I started getting calls from members of Congress. The question was like, what happened? Well, here's the thing. We as an agency, just a few months ahead of that, in November of 2018, we landed on Mars. And we landed on Mars for the 8th time in human history. And the United States of America is the only country that's ever been able to achieve that. And now we do it with international partners, as a matter of fact. But what was interesting is how much noise it created when China landed on the far side of the moon. And of course, I sent a tweet congratulating them. And it made a lot of people concerned. But I think the important thing is it's not just that we landed on Mars, which by the way is far more difficult than landing on the far side of the moon. But then just a few short months after we landed on Mars for the 8th time in human history with a very sophisticated robot that is still delivering amazing science and technology and discovery. After doing that, we flew by an object in the Kuiper Belt, way beyond Pluto, with the same little robot that gave us the beautiful images of Pluto back in 2015, the New Horizons spacecraft. And of course, what we found in this, basically an asteroid in the Kuiper Belt, is that it was a binary contact. It was basically two asteroids that had come together and bound to each other, which was not expected, but still amazing. And the images we got from that were stunning. And again, that was 4 billion miles from Earth. Around that same time, we, NASA, the United States of America, we entered orbit around a little asteroid called Bennu, about 2 billion miles from Earth in deep space, with a little robot called OSIRIS-REx. And OSIRIS-REx is going to be doing not just a close approach, but it's going to go and do a touch and go on Bennu and bring a sample of Bennu back to Earth in 2023. This will be the first time the United States of America does a sample return mission from an asteroid in deep space. And so right now we're orbiting Bennu in very close proximity. We just did a what we call a dress rehearsal, and we went down to about 70 meters off the surface of Bennu, got beautiful images of its surface. My point is this: the United States of America and NASA, we are doing stunning things all the time. And in fact, recently, I should say just a few short months after we entered orbit around Bennu and did the flyby of an object in the Kuiper Belt, at that point, we launched a Crew Dragon, a SpaceX Crew Dragon, on a Falcon 9 rocket to the International Space Station, where it docked, automatically rendezvoused and docked with the International Space Station, and then safely came back to the Earth. And here in just less than a month now, we're going to launch another Crew Dragon to the International Space Station, this time with humans. Now, we haven't done this. We haven't flown humans into space from the United States of America since 2011, the retirement of the space shuttles. But I guess my point, but we're doing it now. My point in saying all this is that NASA is methodically going step by step through a number of very stunning achievements that should be inspiring the world. And the reason I thought it was important to come talk to CSIS and the great folks that are interested in American national security strategy is because, as you mentioned in the bio, I used to be a military pilot by trade. And as a military pilot, we go through what we call professional military education. And when we go through that, we learn about the dime theory of national power. Well, what is the dime theory? Well, you take, it's an acronym. D is diplomatic power, I is information power, M is military power, and E is economic power. And so the question is, how does NASA play in the dime theory of national power for the United States of America? Because it became apparent to me, as members of Congress were calling, became apparent to me that we need to be more engaged in the national security apparatus, the national strategy apparatus. I don't necessarily mean security in the military sense, but from a strategic perspective, we need to be engaged with our interagency partners and with our international partners in a very robust way. And we have been, but I think maybe NASA hasn't been as good at promoting those aspects. NASA is all about science and technology and discovery, which are critically important. But I think less salient is the idea that NASA is a tool of diplomacy, a tool of information, a tool of economic power. So I'm going to go through the dime theory and how NASA plays into each one, and then we can open it up to a few questions. On the diplomatic side, Todd, we have the International Space Station, which has been operating now for 20 consecutive years with humans on orbit. So when we think about kids that are in college these days, there's kids in college that their entire life we have had Americans living and working in space. And of course, astronauts from other nations as well, and cosmonauts from Russia. But 15 nations have been operating the International Space Station. The United States of America is, of course, the most important one. We provide 77% of the resources to the International Space Station. But 15 nations, we've had experiments from 108 different countries and territories on the International Space Station, and we've had astronauts from 19 different countries. So the International Space Station is an example of how NASA can be used as a tool of diplomacy. So the question is, how do we use that tool of diplomacy to advance our national objectives? And I think, when we think about how we engage with the rest of the world, NASA should definitely be in the mix. There are countries out there that maybe aren't so friendly with the United States of America who desperately want to engage with NASA on missions. Certainly, even human spaceflight missions. And those kind of engagements, it basically gives us maybe some leverage. I don't know if it's leverage. It depends nation by nation, but it gives us an opportunity to engage in dialogue, maybe have, you know, a sweetener for, you know, a trade deal or something like that. So NASA should be, and actually is, engaged in these kind of activities, but I think we could actually do more in that sense. It should also be said that we currently have over 700 active agreements with countries all around the world. And of course, those agreements are led by the State Department. I should say they're agreements between states. So the State Department is very involved, but they're started and led by agency to agency cooperation at the space exploration or the science level. And so NASA is very engaged in those over 700 active agreements. So that's kind of what NASA does on the diplomacy side. As we move forward, you can see behind me, I've got the Artemis logo. We're going to the moon, according to the President's Space Policy Directive 1. We're going to the moon. We're going sustainably. We're going with international partners, and we're going with commercial partners. We're going to go and learn how to live and work on another world using the resources of that other world, namely the hundreds of millions of tons of water ice on the south pole of the moon. We're going to take that knowledge and we're going to go all the way to Mars. That's basically the nutshell of the President's first space policy directive. This time, though, when we go to the moon, we're going with international partners. We want to take what we've learned from the International Space Station and we want to broaden it out all the way to the moon. And of course, that's what NASA is working on the diplomacy side. When we think about the I in DIME, information power, and I think this gets missed by a lot of people in the international strategic kind of arena. We think back in history. It was Apollo 8, 1968, Christmas Eve, Apollo 8, 1968, December 24th. We had 3 American astronauts orbiting the moon for the first time in human history in a mission that many thought was a very dangerous mission. But the intelligence at the time was that the Soviet Union was going to be orbiting the moon by the end of the year, and so we had to get a jump on it. And so, our astronauts launched to the moon on a few days before Christmas, and they were orbiting the moon on Christmas Eve. And when they broadcast from the moon, on Apollo 8, they didn't land, but they orbited for the first time. They went to low lunar orbit. When they broadcast from the moon, their broadcast was seen or heard by 1/4 of the people on the planet. That is an astonishing tool of information power. It basically says to the world that the United States of America is preeminent in space exploration, that we have the technological prowess, the economic prowess, the political prowess to achieve these absolutely stunning achievements. And from that, we were able to rally the world behind what the United States was trying to achieve at the time. So that's a tool of information power. It should also be noted that when they did broadcast from the moon, what our astronauts broadcast, they read from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then they wished everybody a Merry Christmas before they signed off. Now we have to remember what was going on in the world at the time. The Soviet Union had banned religion, including Christianity. And here we had 3 American astronauts celebrating Christmas around the moon and broadcasting behind the Iron Curtain. There aren't many elements of national power in 1968 where you would be able to reach tens of millions of people behind the Iron Curtain. NASA could do it. NASA is the one agency on the planet that has that ability to reach that many people. And of course, that was Apollo 8. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in 1969, it wasn't seen by 1 out of every 4 people. It was seen by 1 out of every 1 people on the planet. Again, that is an amazing tool of national power, information power. I would also say, since I've been the NASA administrator, when we landed InSight on Mars, which was the 8th lander that the United States of America has put on Mars, when we landed InSight on Mars, we were on the cover of every publication worldwide. I say that. I'm sure there are publications that we weren't on the cover of, but it was astonishing to me to see how many hundreds of newspapers we were on the cover of. In fact, one of the publications was and I don't know if we were on the cover or not. I saw it online, but it was a publication in Iran. In fact, it was a publication in Tehran. It was, and the subtitle of the publication was the hardline newspaper of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They don't generally say nice things about the United States of America, but in this particular case, they talked about our mission, landing on Mars, that it was the 8th time in history. And the last paragraph of that article that they had written, it talked specifically about all of our international partners that were with us on that mission. So we talk about, we had France with us, and we had Germany with us, and we had Spain with us. Poland is doing a lot of the science from the data that's coming back from that mission. So all of that was embedded in the article on Insight in this newspaper. And this is the kind of thing that I think is important for our country, because it enables young people. It enables us to reach young people all around the world and change their perceptions towards the United States of America. In a lot of these countries, they don't get good messages about our nation, which we all love. And so this gives us an opportunity to break behind, whether it's the Iron Curtain in 1968 or whether it's into Tehran in 2018. The idea is we can get our messages to the world about the good things that the United States of America does when those stories are not often told around the world. So that's the information piece. On the military side of things, NASA doesn't play in the military side of things. What we do is we do develop technology, and a lot of those technologies are applicable to national security capabilities, but we are intentionally not involved in national security or defense. And we do that purposefully because we want to make sure that we are a tool of diplomacy. Those other elements of national power are where NASA plays. Soft power. We want to wear the white hat. We want countries around the world to want to partner with NASA. And I can tell you that's true. They do want to partner with NASA. Even countries that are not always friendly, they really want to partner with NASA, which is good to see. So that's on the military side. Then on the economic side, and this we could have an entire conference, Todd, on the economic side alone. But when we think about how we're watching this, some people might have internet broadband from space. If I come from Oklahoma, in rural Oklahoma, if you don't have internet broadband from space, you're probably not going to have internet broadband at all. And all these space-based communication capabilities were born from this little agency back in the 1960s called NASA. And so those capabilities have now, it's not just internet broadband from space, it's DirecTV, it's Dish Network, it's XM radio, and of course a whole host of now low Earth orbit, low latency, high throughput constellations for space-based communications that are going to basically create cell phone-like networks in space. And those constellations are going to be amazing, and NASA of course wants to see them be successful. We do have challenges with space debris, which is another challenge that we're going to have to deal with, not just as an agency, but as a country. And so we've got to make sure we're very responsible with how we move forward with a lot of these low Earth orbit constellations that are going to transform how we live, but also create some other challenges. But we talk about communications, we talk about navigation. Think about life without GPS. We talk about how we produce food and how we produce energy. NASA is now engaged in activities with farmers to reduce water usage while increasing crop yields at the same time. So we can increase crop yields while reducing water usage by about 25%, preserving nitrates in the soil, which enables us to feed more of the world than ever before. So the way we produce food, the way we produce energy cleanly. So, if you have somebody that is, drilling for oil or natural gas, and there's a leak and it's emitting, greenhouse gases, we can now, using our space-based assets, we can detect those leaks of methane or whatever they are very rapidly and inform the energy companies. And they like it. Why do they like it? Because then they don't get fined by the EPA. So the environmental organizations like that, of course, the energy companies like that, and NASA gets to be the good guy, letting people know, hey, here's how we do things better. So the way we produce energy, the way we do, of course, disaster relief, the way we do national security. Like I said, we don't play in the military side of things, but we do a lot of technology development that the Department of Defense can benefit from. So I think, of course, the way we predict weather, the way we understand climate, all of these capabilities are important. What I hear about as the NASA administrator all the time is Tang and Velcro. And I can tell you, that those were things that, quite frankly, NASA didn't even invent, although we somehow get credit for them, probably because we highlighted their importance, back in the Apollo program. But we've done a whole lot more than Tang and Velcro over the last 50 years. So on the economic side, that's kind of the tradition. You look at the return on investment for our very small, investment in space. Our budget for NASA is less than half of 1% of the federal budget, and yet we talk about all these capabilities and technologies that have transformed the human condition. And we put out a book every year called NASA Spinoffs. It's probably an inch thick every year of all the spinoffs that NASA has done that have transformed the way we live. Things that you don't think about, like the cell phone in your camera. The cell phone in your camera was a NASA development for a Mars lander. And so these are things that NASA doesn't always get credit for, but of course we are commercializing these activities every day. Nokia was the one who first licensed the little cameras for cell phones. Okay, so we talk about the economic piece. It goes beyond just spin-offs and capabilities that are commercialized. Right now, we are creating a robust commercial marketplace in low Earth orbit where NASA is a customer rather than the owner and operator of launch vehicles. So as I alluded to earlier, May 27th, we're launching Commercial Crew to the International Space Station. First time we've launched American astronauts on American rockets from American soil since 2011, the retirement of the space shuttles. And that's something we're very, very excited about. But at the same time, the goal is not just to get our astronauts to the International Space Station. The goal is to create a domestic commercial marketplace that enables us to have exports. A lot of people watching know that my boss is very keen on the trade deficit and the balance of payments. If we go back to 2012, when it comes to commercial launch, the United States of America had exactly 0% of the market share. Because of investments NASA has made into commercial resupply of the International Space Station, commercial crew of the International Space Station, the United States of America now has it's somewhere around 70% of the international market share for commercial launch. And that is an important capability that we need to preserve. And by the way, I think it's going to continue to grow because we have created an environment of competition. So we want to be one customer of many customers for access to low Earth orbit. And we're doing that with commercial resupply. We have already done that. We're now doing it with commercial crew, and we're in the midst of doing that. We're eventually going to have commercial space stations in low Earth orbit. And then NASA truly is going to be a customer in low Earth orbit. Then we can take the resources provided by the American taxpayer, and we can do the things that have never been done before. We want to land the first woman on the South Pole of the Moon by 2024. That's another stunning achievement that has a lot of implications on the I side of DIME, the information side of DIME. Basically sharing with the world that the United States of America is going to continue doing stunning things. And it would be really nice for you to partner with us rather than partner with maybe our international competitors. How about that? So these are, I think, capabilities that we need to continue to develop. But the E in DIME, it's not just about DirecTV, Dish Network. It's not just about GPS. It's also about creating a robust commercial marketplace in low Earth orbit. We're using the International Space Station right now to develop all kinds of technologies that are going to be transformative for human lives on Earth. Things like we are able to compound pharmaceuticals in low Earth orbit in a microgravity environment that we could not do here on Earth. We're able to create immunizations in orbit that we could not create here on Earth. We're able to print human organs in 3D. You can't do it on Earth because the tissue just goes flat. Now we're in the early phases of this, but we're proving that we can create human tissue in 3D on the International Space Station. And eventually we'd like to see if we could use adult stem cells to create human organs in 3D on the ISS. Advanced materials, another amazing technology created by a company that is basically NASA is a customer of this company, is the ability to create an artificial retina that can go in the eyeball, so that people who have macular degeneration, they don't have to lose their eyesight anymore. That type of material can only be created in the microgravity of space. And so the International Space Station is the place where we can commercialize those activities. Imagine a box that fits in the palm of your hand. It goes up to a commercial space station in low Earth orbit, and days later it comes back with 1,000 artificial retinas on board. Each one of those artificial retinas reimbursed by Medicare to the tune of $50,000 to $75,000 each. So all of a sudden the business case closes, and there's yet another important commercial capability in space. But again, the idea is we're creating these commercial capabilities in low Earth orbit so that we can use the resources that we have to go further. But even when we go further, we have an intent to commercialize for another reason, so that we can go further yet again. And I think that we're going to see those capabilities basically taking off faster than we've ever seen before. So those are kind of the elements of national power: diplomatic power, information power, military power, economic power, and how NASA plays in each one of them. But there's a lot going on, Todd, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that people may have. Thank you for doing this, by the way.
Oh, and thank you for joining us for this. We've got a ton of questions that are coming in. Let me start with one that's near and dear to our hearts here at CSIS, looking at space security. One of the things that is a bit disturbing about the space environment today is there aren't a lot of commonly accepted norms of behavior. And when you talk about NASA's as an instrument of soft power, what can NASA do, and what can you do through programs you're working on now to try to help establish and facilitate a consensus around some basic norms of behavior in space?
So that's a perfect question, and that's exactly what NASA. That's what NASA has the ability to do as an element of national power. So as I mentioned, we are moving forward very quickly with the Artemis program. We want to land not just the next man, but the first woman on the south pole of the moon by 2024. We want to be able to characterize the water ice in the regolith, use it for life support, maybe even figure out how to use it for fuel. Could we create, for example, liquid hydrogen out of the water ice? So these are important capabilities that we need to develop, but it's also the fact that these are capabilities that our international partners want to be with us on. There was a moment in time when we retired the shuttles and we canceled the Constellation program where our international partners were very disillusioned. And of course, that encourages them to go abroad and to seek partnerships other places. Well, now we're saying we want to go to the moon, we want to go sustainably. We're going to build a space station in orbit around the moon. We call it the Gateway. That's going to give us ability at the moon so our landing systems can be reusable. We just put out contracts to 3 companies to start the process of developing human landers that are going to be commercially owned and operated and have NASA as a partner. Those commercial landers, eventually we want them to be reusable, going back and forth to the Gateway so they can get fuel and power and all the things that they're going to need to be successful. The important thing is countries all around the world want to be a part of this. That's the element of national power. And so then we can say, okay, if you want to be part of this, here are the norms of behavior that we expect to see. And if you adhere to these norms of behavior, then we would love to have you be a part of this. But if you're going to do things that damage space, if you're going to do things that put space exploration at risk, then it's going to be very difficult for NASA to step up and say, hey, we want you to be a partner with us on this program. So I would say that what we need to do as an agency, now that we're getting ready to launch astronauts again, we've got a program to go to the moon sustainably. I don't like to say going back to the moon. We're going forward to the moon because we're going to stay, and then we're going to take what we learn onto Mars. And when we talk about these capabilities as an element of national power, it's in essence leverage that enables us to talk to our international partners about what is expected behavior. And of course, we've been working with the State Department on what a framework like that would look like. We might have more to say on that next week.
All right. So more to come on that. We're getting a number of questions about international participation in the Artemis program, and specifically about the framework, but also about what's the potential role of a future partnership with Russia and the European Space Agency. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of bringing the partners we already have on the International Space Station into the Artemis program?
That's a great question. So I'll tell you, when we think about the partnership with Russia, it goes back to 1975, the height of the Cold War. It was the Apollo-Soyuz program. After the Apollo program concluded, we entered into a partnership with the Soviet Union at the time. Remember, the height of the Cold War, 1975. We entered into a partnership with the Soviet Union to do the Apollo-Soyuz program, and it was amazingly successful. Tom Stafford, General Tom Stafford, a fellow Oklahoman who's a good friend of mine, was the one who actually went through the hatch and shook hands with a cosmonaut in space for the first time in history. That was in 1975. We fast forward, we had the shuttle program, and the Soviet Union had the Mir program, a space station. And so NASA and Roscosmos partnered on the Shuttle Mir program, which again was a very successful collaboration at a time when tensions were high. And then, of course, after the Shuttle Mir program, we had the International Space Station program, which has two primary segments, the American segment and the Russian segment. So the International Space Station, now we've had astronauts and cosmonauts living and working in space now for 20 years in a row on the International Space Station. So this is a partnership that has enabled a channel of communications between these two countries that obviously we have all kinds of terrestrial disputes. But NASA is this unique kind of creature that has the ability to unite people. And we're talking about NASA and Roscosmos working together on the International Space Station. Just a few weeks ago, we launched one of our NASA astronauts on a Russian Soyuz rocket. And so this is a partnership that has a long history. Does that mean it's easy? Absolutely not. Is it important? I believe it is. I believe it is an important relationship, and it enables us to have a channel of communication that we otherwise would not have. And I think it provides hope. It provides hope to countries all around the world that that maybe cooperation can continue in some ways, even though there is tensions between nations. And so I do think it's important. When we go to the moon, we are interested in taking the partners that are with us on the International Space Station with us. So the question is Russia going to want to be a part of it, and at what level? That's a question I don't know the answer to at this point. But certainly I would like to see the relationship continue. Even after we launch American astronauts on American rockets, we have to remember that the International Space Station, half of it is Russian. And so what that means is that if we're going to keep it crewed by both countries, we're going to need to have Russians launch with us, and we're going to need to launch on Soyuz rockets at the same time. That way we both continue a permanent presence on the International Space Station. So I think those are important capabilities. And yeah, I'd like to see those relationships continue. I want to be really clear. We have to be careful because I think there are times when we don't want to be dependent. We look back at from 2011 to today. We have put ourselves in a position where we are dependent on launching Americans on Russian Soyuz rockets. And so the partnership is a partnership where we give them cash and they launch our astronauts. That's not the partnership that we desire. The partnership we desire is an equal partnership where we launch on their rockets and they launch on our rockets. As far as the European Space Agency goes, yes, they've been amazing partners for so many years. They're going to have, knocking on wood, but they're going to have a very robust capability in our lunar architecture. Same with Japan and Canada. We look forward to working with all of them as we go to the moon. And if Russia is interested, we would like to see what they're interested in doing. I want to make sure that we're not creating a dependency, which is where we've been for the last 9 years.
Yeah, and a related question I'm seeing here from the audience is, what about new countries that want to partner with NASA on the Artemis program? Particularly countries that may be somewhat new to space. Are there going to be roles for countries like that, even if they may not have technology that's directly applicable to the Artemis mission? Are there going to be other ways they can contribute?
Absolutely, 100%. And we want them to join this effort. I can give you some examples. Australia stood up a space agency just a little over a year ago. They did not have a space. To be clear, you go back to Apollo, we had one international partner, and it was Australia. They had a big communication network for the moon at Canberra. And they provided the first images that we saw of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. That data was coming through the Canberra network that gave us our image. So we did have a partner in Apollo. This time when we go to the moon, we're obviously doing it very differently. We want partners. We want lots of partners, and we want them to help us achieve these end states that we seek. Australia stepped up to the plate. Maybe a year and a half ago, they created a brand new space agency, and they just got appropriated about $150 million for their new space agency, and they have dedicated all of it to the Artemis program. This is not a traditional partner on the International Space Station. Their budget is still small, but it is also growing. And what's fascinating is I've seen the polling of the people in Australia. Their space agency is so supported by their people. They want to see an Australian on the moon. I don't know if that's going to be in the cards in the near future, but certainly they have amazing robotic capabilities. We think about how they do mining in very remote parts of Australia where the conditions are very harsh. A lot of those robotic mining capabilities would have application maybe even on the moon. And so we're going through a process of evaluating what capabilities they could bring to bear that would be helpful for us. But other countries like the United Arab Emirates, Luxembourg, there's a lot of countries that maybe have not been prominent in space exploration in the past that are stepping up big time. And we're very keen on United Arab Emirates. Here is a country that wants to not just lead in space exploration, they want to lead countries in the Middle East and get young women involved in STEM. I mean, this is another great capability for us to reach out to countries that are leaning forward on improving the world.
about how how NASA can fit into the E in the DIME framework of national power, specifically in terms of the cislunar economy. That is, the potential for mining, manufacturing, and other economic activity that could take place on the moon one day. Do you see NASA as having kind of a pathfinding role in leading to that?
Absolutely. In fact, that's what we're developing under the Artemis program. So we look at what we're doing in low Earth orbit. We've invested, billions of dollars into developing commercial resupply of the International Space Station, billions of dollars into creating commercial crew to the International Space Station. And of course, we're starting big investments now into commercializing low Earth orbit with space stations. I'd like to see a dozen space stations in low Earth orbit operated by commercial entities and having commercial capabilities, whether it's research, whether it's, it could be even tourism, it could be manufacturing, anything that needs microgravity would be a market there. But yes, the cislunar economy, certainly we want to lead the way here. And then as we move forward, we want to turn it over more and more, turn it over to commercial capabilities so that we can go to Mars. So when we think about the cislunar economy, as I mentioned earlier, the lunar lander that we just put forward 3 contracts on, each one of those companies are commercial companies. We don't want to own and operate the lander for the moon. We want them to own and operate the lander. We will do a public-private partnership to help them develop it, but then we want them to compete on innovation. We want them to compete on price. And NASA wants to be a customer for the long run. And because we've done it this way, where we create the markets, what we're seeing is costs come down, both in low Earth orbit, and we're hopeful that we will see the same thing all the way to the moon. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for all kinds of commercial activity in cislunar space. Did that, Todd, was there something more specific than that in that question?
No, I think that pretty much covered it. I see a number of other questions this morning. I think were inspired by a tweet that you sent out this morning about a near Earth orbit asteroid that NASA and the Space Force are working together on how to track these asteroids that are out there in deep space, but are going to make close passes to Earth in the future. So a specific question from one of the listeners is about the DART program. That's an asteroid redirect program. And how is NASA working with international partners to develop planetary defense mechanisms?
Yeah, so we have what's called at the agency, we have a Planetary Defense Coordination Office. And so we work with interagency partners and we work with international partners on strategies for how to detect and track and characterize and create better modeling. We got back in 2005, we got direction from Congress to basically detect and track 90% of the NEOs, near Earth objects that we call them NEOs, 90% of the NEOs that are 140 meters or larger. Of the 90% that we're supposed to be able to detect and track, so far, we believe there's something around 25,000 of those objects. We have found about 40% of those so far. So we need to make some investments as an agency into our capabilities to detect these objects and then characterize these objects. And this is where NASA and the Space Force are going to work together because we have these capabilities to detect. So space-based telescopes to get that early detection. Once detected, we can use ground-based telescopes to make sure that we're tracking those deep space near Earth objects. Objects that have the potential of maybe eventually coming on a collision course with the Earth. To be clear, right now we don't see anything that is on a collision course with the Earth. But this asteroid that I tweeted about this morning, Apophis, it's gonna be coming close enough to Earth in 2029 that it's going to go under some of our satellites in geostationary orbit. And in fact, the gravity of it could could displace some of those satellites, which is not going to be good. But the good thing is we have the ability to detect that object and track it and characterize it. It's one of the reasons we are doing the technology development capability that was mentioned by your questioner called DART, Double Asteroid Redirect Mission. So we're using the Planetary Defense Coordination Office within NASA to bring together the Science Mission Directorate and the Space Technology Mission Directorate of NASA to figure out how we would, if there was an object that was going to collide with Earth, how would we deal with that? You know, I have Bill Nye. I hear him, you know, he's with the Planetary Society. He has a statement that I think is pretty funny. He says, look, the evidence is clear that the dinosaurs did not have a space program. We do. And so we need to be making sure that we're prepared for an eventual impact that could be devastating. And so the Double Asteroid Redirect Mission, which is an international collaboration, but NASA is very involved in it. In fact, we're leading it. We're going to work on how would we deflect an asteroid that was going to be on a collision course with the Earth. If we impact it, how much would it move? But we've got other ideas as well. If you fly one object in formation with another object, the gravity of the two objects affect each other. And if you can model out these objects that are orbiting the sun that could be on a collision course with the Earth, if you can model it out far enough, you can actually redirect that asteroid without a collision at all, but just using the gravity of one object to pull on another object. And if you're doing that 20 years in advance, you can have a big change in direction over the course of those next 20 years. So this is something I think is an important mission for the country, and we need to be thinking about it. What the Space Force brings to NASA in this endeavor are capabilities for like cislunar space situational awareness that we can then use to help us inform our models. And so just because they're doing cislunar space situational awareness doesn't mean that those capabilities can't see a lot further and help us as we create the catalog that Congress has required us to create. But Todd, I'm telling you, this little part of NASA does not get nearly the attention that it should. And the fact that we've got a Space Force that's willing to work with us on this now is important.
Well, speaking of the Space Force, I'm seeing a question here from an audience member about how do you think about and how do you reconcile the apparent discrepancy between the necessity of considering space as a warfighting domain and a military domain and the great commercial and civil opportunities that there are for cooperation and diplomatic engagement in space. How do we reconcile those two things going forward?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's really easy. I'm a Navy pilot by trade, and so Teddy Roosevelt created the Great White Fleet at the turn of the century, or a little after the turn of the century, and he did it with a purpose. The purpose was to make sure that everybody in the world understood that American commerce will not be threatened by our activities. Our commercial activities will not be threatened by pirates or foreign sovereigns that want to do us damage. So the Great White Fleet was not just to protect commerce, but it floated all around the world to wave the flag and say our commerce will be protected. And that's really what it was all about. So when we think about space commerce, which is critically important to the future, I mean, if we just look at the satellite communications industry alone, I think I hate to put, I think there was a AIA or somebody did a study and came up with, I think it was the Satellite Industry Association did a study. They said it was a $400 billion annual economy. And of course, a lot of that is American. And if we're going to protect that, and by the way, it's going to grow significantly. If we're going to protect it, then we need to have the ability to protect it. Just like the Navy protects commerce on the seas, we need a Space Force to protect commerce in space.
All right, and then another question. We're getting a lot of questions about astronauts and the next generation of astronauts for the Artemis program. So can you tell us any news about that in terms of, are you going to be recruiting a lot of new astronauts? Are existing astronauts going to retrain and transition over for the new Artemis missions? And also for the younger audience that may be watching, folks in high school or college, what is NASA looking for in its next generation of astronauts, and what could they be doing today to prepare for that?
Yeah, it's that's another very good question. So to start, the next man and the first one on the moon are likely already at NASA. So within our current astronaut corps, that's where those astronauts will come from. And then when we think about the missions that come after that, I would say at least for a few missions, the astronauts will come from the already existing astronaut corps. But it is true, we just had a brand new astronaut class, and they have a lot. It's crazy to think the opportunity that they have in front of them. They could be flying on, Falcon rockets to the International Space Station in a Crew Dragon. They could be launching on Vulcan rockets on a Starliner. They could be launching on Orion to the moon. And of course, with the new program we have with the commercial landers, there is just so much opportunity for these brand new astronauts to look at being a part of in the future. But yes, we just closed a round of astronaut applications. I don't know how many thousands of applications we got, but we got a lot. And I would expect that, it's hard. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's very difficult. A lot of people apply to be an astronaut just because they want to get the rejection letter, to be quite frank. But at the same time, we want the best of the best. And so I would say, if you're in high school or even younger and you want to consider being an astronaut, the STEM fields are critically important. Becoming a scientist or an engineer, those are two ways that you can do it. And of course, being a military test pilot is another way to become an astronaut. But all of it's going to require basically getting involved in the STEM fields for what it takes to be an astronaut.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Seeing other questions about SLS, the new launch system that NASA is working on, a super heavy launch capability. One of the listeners' question is, of the 3 contractors just announced for the lunar landers, none of them plan to launch on SLS. So, is NASA rethinking the SLS program and the role of that in the future Lunar Gateway and overall Artemis program?
Absolutely not. We are not rethinking SLS. When we think about how we're going to get our astronauts to the moon, there's only one vehicle to get our astronauts there. And of course, that's the Orion crew capsule with the European service module. And that there's only one vehicle that can launch that, and that's the SLS. So that's an important capability. And when we land on the moon in 2024, that's going to be the vehicle that takes our astronauts to the moon. Now, once they're in orbit around the moon in the Orion crew capsule, they're going to transfer into a landing system. And that landing system, of course, would be developed by one of those 3 commercial companies. And each of them have very unique ways of landing on the moon. Basically, single stage, multi-stage, two, and then 3-stage. And so we want to work with those companies to come up with the optimum solution over the next 10 months for how we're going to achieve our basically 2-pronged approach. One is we need to go soon. And the reason we go fast is because it reduces the political risk. This agency has been cast to and fro by programs that get started and canceled. We got to make sure we don't do that anymore. So going fast reduces, it doesn't retire, but it reduces political risk. But we also need to go sustainably. So we want to make sure that by 2024, we have the next man and the first woman on the south pole of the moon. We want to make sure by 2028, we have sustainability at the moon. And so these are the two things that we're trying to achieve with these human landing systems. But you know, at least as far as we can see at this point, our astronauts are going to launch there on the Orion crew capsule. Maybe that won't always be the case. Maybe there will be competitors that enter the market for taking humans to the moon and even onto Mars. But right now, between now and 2024, the Orion crew capsule with an SLS rocket, that's the way to do it.
And so I see our time is drawing near. I would be remiss if I didn't ask a few questions related to the coronavirus pandemic that's affecting us all. So, you know, first question is just about how NASA is handling the response to the virus, and in particular, you know, the CARES Act included a number of new authorities so that different government agencies could help some of their contractor workforce so they don't lose that expertise and continue to, you know, pay those folks so they can pay their employees so we don't see, you know, more massive layoffs than we've already seen. Can you just give us a bit of an update on how NASA is responding to this pandemic?
Absolutely. So we have 10 centers across the United States of America, and we've broken it up into stages: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. And when the pandemic started spreading rapidly, we moved to stage 2 very quickly, which was highly encouraging telework. And then we moved to stage 3, which was mandatory telework, and then stage 4, which was shut down entirely. At the same time, we had mission essential functions that needed to go forward. We think about the importance of launching commercial crew to the International Space Station. We need to make sure that we have access to the International Space Station. And so we needed to move forward with that program. Obviously, the ISS is a $100 billion investment by the American taxpayer. We need to keep that program successful and moving forward. So commercial crew was mission essential. And Mars 2020, which is now Mars Perseverance, which I think is the perfect name for launching a robot in the middle of a pandemic. Mars Perseverance is mission essential as well. And that's because Earth and Mars are on the same side of the sun once every 26 months. If we don't launch Mars Perseverance, it will sit idle for 26 months, and it will cost $500 million to preserve it for all of that time. And so we made that mission essential as well. So we went through these stages. While we went through the stages, we made sure we identified what was mission essential. On those mission essential missions, we wanted to make sure that our people were safe. So within those missions, we had a target of making sure people were more safe working for NASA than even staying at home. I know that sounds ambitious, and it probably is, but that was our goal. So we made sure that people had personal protective equipment. We made sure people had, we mixed up the shifts, so we had fewer people working on a vehicle at any one time. And then, of course, we maintained social distancing. Those two programs, Mars Perseverance and Commercial Crew, have been very successful in keeping people healthy and at the same time moving forward. And it's also important to note that I think it's the United States of America and the world, they need to be inspired right now. And so we've been making sure that we keep those missions going forward. At the same time, and Todd, this is important, we've been very clear with everybody who works on these missions that if they don't feel comfortable or if they don't feel safe, that's fine. We encourage them to speak up, to share with their supervisor, and without any retribution, we will find something else for them to do, without any questions asked. So we've been very clear, if people don't feel comfortable, we don't want them working on these missions. But at the same time, we're doing everything to keep our people safe. And so far, we've been very successful in doing so. It is also true that the missions that have not been deemed essential are having challenges. In other words, they're going to have schedule delays and probably some cost overruns because of the delay. And so we're going to have to work through that in the coming years. To your point on the CARES Act, tremendously helpful. One of the challenges we have is a lot of people don't realize most of our workforce is government support contractors. And the only way they get paid is if they show up to work and get paid. They do their time card and they get paid that way. They're not on salary the way civil servants are. So what that means is when they stay at home, they can't do their work. Then if they stay at home and they can't do their work because they need to have access to facilities and that kind of thing, they're not getting paid. The CARES Act was tremendously helpful for the members of, if there's any members of Congress watching or staffers watching, thank you for the CARES Act. It was tremendously helpful to keep our people on the payroll. What we need is we need to keep people healthy and safe, keep people home, and keep people employed so that when we're ready, we can get everybody back into action. So these stunning achievements yet again.
All right, and one final question before we go, also related to the pandemic and the resulting economic crisis that's affecting the whole nation. In many cases, it's affecting families in very individual ways. So the question we're seeing from several people is, in light of the mind-boggling deficits that we're seeing now, the federal government is projected to run a $4 trillion deficit just in 2020. What's the case that you're going to make to Congress and the American people in light of these deficits for why we should keep funding NASA and the Artemis program? How do you make that case now?
Oh, I think it's the same case it always has been, and it shouldn't change. In fact, the case for NASA spending is probably going to be enhanced. So when we think about why does the federal government spend money when the private sector stops? Well, it's because they want to make sure, we look at the CARES Act, we look at the Paycheck Protection Program. These are all things, they called it a stimulus package. I don't know if the word stimulus is right, but it's at least a package to prevent us from slipping into a very deep recession. I would say it was a stimulus if our economy we're trying to make it go stronger. What we're trying to do is prevent it from getting worse, given the fact that the economy is shut down right now. And so when we do these kind of stimulus packages, the purpose is for the government to spend when the private sector won't, for the government to invest when the private sector won't invest. And so that's really what we're doing right now. And of course, I've seen a number of members on both sides of the aisle talk about the importance of doing an infrastructure package at this time. Well, to me, it makes sense that an infrastructure package would include NASA. And so we would want to be a part of an infrastructure package as well. But I think it's important to note that if in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, if the government is trying to stimulate the economy, if they were to turn around and cut spending to already successful and already moving forward programs, that would have the opposite effect. So I don't think we're in any danger. I've talked to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle in the last week, 2 weeks. I've talked to probably 24 members on both sides of the aisle, House and Senate, and they all say the same thing. Stay after it, keep getting there. There's strong bipartisan support for the Artemis program. I don't see anybody saying to me that we're going to have to cut spending because of the coronavirus pandemic. I haven't heard that yet. I think just the opposite. People are saying, hey, we're going to do an infrastructure package. And of course, NASA would be, we would love to be a part of that if they do that.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you've got a big, important agency to run. And so, I really want to thank you sincerely for taking time out of your busy schedule to have this discussion with us. A lot of great things to think about. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Todd. Always fun. Thank you.
All right. And thank you all for listening in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on our website. So please check back there and send the link to other people. Thank you all and stay safe.